Hello, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be with you all again for the weekly share. This week, Thursday night, is going to be Hanukkah, and we'd like to give an overview this evening in part one of this Kabbalah of Hanukkah, exactly what is the inside story of Hanukkah. You know, Hanukkah today is quite different. The Rabbi instituted public menorah lightings, and whether you're in London in Trafalgar Square, Paris in the Champs-Élysées by the Eiffel Tower, or you're on the lawn in front of the White House in Washington, the image of Hanukkah today is not just of the menorah in the window or by the door, but it's of these giant menorahs in public places which shout out that there is the power of light over might, and the freedom of religion, the pride in being Jewish. And of course, Hanukkah is perhaps the most celebrated Jewish festival. We could argue that it actually coincides with something else which is also celebrated, but the fact is, in the Jewish world, it's hugely, hugely celebrated, and now it's taken a higher level. The Rebbe took it to a level, a real public level. Everything that happens down here has an effect up there, and of course everything up there is reflected down here. And tonight we're going to go into an inward bound journey into the Kabbalah of Hanukkah and having a look at the real esoteric miracle that took place on this very, very beautiful Yom Tov. If I can preface it with one more thing, and that is, we've just come from the celebration of Yud Tes Kislev, Chof Kislev, the 19th and the 20th of Kislev, the day of liberation of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, from incarceration in jail in St. Petersburg. And it's well known that the reason he was incarcerated, there is a physical reason, but also a spiritual reason. The spiritual reason was that there was a kitrug, there was a heavenly accusation that he was revealing too much of the inner dimension of the Torah, Pnimius HaTorah, too much Chassidus. And there was an accusation above that perhaps this should be stopped. And he was visited when he was in jail by celestial guests from the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich. He asked them, why is this happening? And they told him, because of this heavenly accusation. So he asked, so should I stop? And they said, no. Now you've got the green light. Through your Mesiras Nefesh, through your self-sacrifice, you've got the green light to go ahead and to complete the Yofutzu Ma'anosecha Chutza. As Mashiach answered the Baal Shem Tov when the Baal Shem Tov had his heavenly ascent on Rosh Hashanah, and the Baal Shem Tov asked Mashiach, when are you coming? Eimosai ka'asimar. Mashiach answered, Lichshiyofutzu ma'anesecha chutza, when your teachings will be widely disseminated. And of course, the Baal Shem Tov taught for his generation, the Maggid of Mezrich taught for his generation, but their teachings were almost small, fiery nuggets of the inner teachings of the Torah. The Alter Rebbe started blazing a new path of Chabad, of bringing those nuggets out, fleshing out the ideas in intellectual concepts, in Chachma, Bina, and Das. It was a completely new way, a new horizon, and there was a new kitrug, there was a new accusation, and it ended on Yud Tes Kislev with the green light, the vindication to go ahead, and the many generations. What is the juxtaposition of Yud Tes Kislev and Hanukkah? Yud Tes Kislev comes, as we know, a mere 6 days before Hanukkah. What is the idea that Yud Tes Kislev precedes Hanukkah, and what is the connection with public menorahs? That's what we're going to explore tonight in our first part of the talk about the Kabbalah of Hanukkah. First of all, let me delineate what was the difference between how we light the menorah today and how they lit the menorah in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. The menorah in the Beis Hamikdash had in fact only 7 branches. It had 3 on either side of the main shaft, and at the top there was a total of 7 lights. As we know today, our menorahs are made of 8 branches. And of course that corresponds to the miracle of the 8 days that the little jar of oil, the jug of oil that was found with the seal of the high priest, which itself was a miracle that they found it, was only enough to light for 1 day, and it lit for 8 days. So some people actually call the menorah today in Israel, they call it the Chanukiah, in order to differentiate between that and the menorah which was in the Beis Hamikdash, but let's call them both the menorah. It's just easier. The menorah of the temple was 7 branches. The menorah which we use today has 8 branches. In addition, the menorah in the times of the Beis Hamikdash was in fact lit by day. It was lit at a time we call Plag HaMincha, which was about an hour and a quarter before the sunset. So it's actually lit by day, although it carried on burning throughout the night. Also, it was lit inside the temple in a room called the Kodesh. This was the room just before the Holy of Holies. So in fact, the menorah was lit inside, and there were only 7 branches, and it was also lit by day. In contrast, the menorah which we light for Hanukkah, first of all, it's lit only after the sunset, and some lights, in fact, after nightfall. It's lit outside, and it has 8 branches. Now, this is surprising because if the lighting of the menorah is to celebrate the rekindling of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, then we have a rule called the Tikkun Rabbanon Ke'en De'oraisa Tikkun, which means everything the rabbis instituted should be on similar lines, if you want, to what the Torah instituted. So why don't we just have a replica, a small replica of the temple menorah, and just like the temple menorah has 7 branches, we should also have 7 branches, and we should light it every single day. And perhaps we should light it for 8 days, just to show the miracle of the 8 days. But why was it instituted that we have all these differences between the menorah which we light today and the menorah that was lit in the Beis Hamikdash? In order to understand that, let's have a look at another festival which we celebrate also very differently. The 2, if you want, rabbinic great festivals of Judaism are Hanukkah and Purim. In both of them, there was an attempt to destroy the Jewish people. Haman wanted to raise a final solution decree against the Jews in the days of Purim, and the Greeks wanted to destroy the temple in the times of Hanukkah. And yet their celebrations are so different. In Purim, we have a Megillah. We read the Megillah inside the synagogue. We have a Su'udah, we have a meal. We dress up. There's a lot of festivity on Purim. Hanukkah, we don't have a Megillah which we read. We celebrate by lighting the candles, and primarily these are days of Hallel and Haidah. We sing Hallel in the synagogue, and we give great thanks to Hashem for the miracles that took place. Why the difference between the 2? It's explained that the main reason is because Purim was a decree against the body of the Jew, whereas Hanukkah was a war against the soul of the Jew. On Purim, since the war was against the body, we celebrate bodily by having a meal, dressing up, festivity. On Hanukkah, where the war was against the soul of the Jew, there we celebrate in a more spiritual way by lighting candles. In which way was the war in Hanukkah against the soul of the Jew? Because it says that the Greeks actually didn't want to destroy Jews, or actually the temple building itself, unlike the Romans who actually did. The Romans killed many, many more Jews and destroyed the temple. The Greeks had a love for culture. They had a love for great architecture and buildings. All they didn't want was that the Jews should have their Torah. It says in the Alanissim prayer, Lahashkicham Torasecha. They wanted the Jews to forget your Torah. They didn't mind culture, but what they didn't want was the Jews to say that this was divine in origin. As the Midrash says, they said, Kisvu lachem al keren hashor, right on the horn of an ox, she'en lahem chelek belekei Yisrael, that you have nothing to do with a god. You want to eat latkes? That's fine. You want to eat donuts? That's fine. But to say that you're eating it because there was a miracle and there's a God that saves you, something that transcends nature, that not. And so consequently, they were fine with the temple. And it says that they did a very, very strange thing indeed. It says that when they came into the temple precinct, unlike the Romans who just destroyed it, burnt it down, the Greeks did a strange thing. Timu kol hashmanim. They looked for the oil which the menorah was kindled with, and they defiled it. Now, the concept of tumah v'tahara, purity and impurity, is a very strange one indeed. Because physically, you cannot see the difference between something which is pure or impure. So, for example, if somebody touches a person who's dead, then they contract a tumah, an impurity. Now, looking at the person, you would know if they were tameh, impure or not. And yet, they couldn't come into the temple precinct until they'd gone through a purification process. So, the idea of purity and impurity is something which transcends the intellect. The Greeks couldn't take that. You want to light the menorah, that's fine. But don't say there's something called pure oil, not pure oil. The high priest had put a seal on all the oils to show that they had been made with the greatest purity. The Greeks didn't pour out the oil. They didn't use it to make French fries. They just timu kol hashmanim. They touched it. They made it impure. And therefore the Jews could light the menorah, but it wouldn't be with pure oil. In fact, there's a tremendous halachic discussion as to why, when the Jews re-entered the temple, why they didn't light with impure oil. Because strictly halachically, if there isn't any other oil to light with, one could possibly light with such oil. In fact, the reason why the one jar of oil which they found stayed alive for 8 days was because it took 4 days to go to a place called Tekoa, which is where the oil was manufactured and made for the temple, to go there, procure new oil and come back. And therefore the miracle had, if you want, to last for 8 days in order that new pure oil had been bought. Why did they want to light the temple lights with pure oil only? Well, the answer is given is because since this was the main focus of the Greeks, to defile, if you want, the purity of the Jews, therefore the Maccabees understood that in order to rededicate the temple, they had to do it with pure oil. So let's carry on and look to see if we can decipher the reason why our menorah has certain differences than the temple menorah, and the main difference being, as highlighted between the difference between Chanukah and Purim, is that the war against the Jews in the days of the Greeks was a war in order to defile, if you want, the soul of the Jewish people. In order to understand this, what we're going to do is we are going to introduce a Kabbalistic concept. The Kabbalistic concept is as follows. On the 24th of Kislev, the battle against the Greeks was won. according to many commentaries, the Meiri and others, there is an opinion that said it was on the 25th, but according to some, it was on the 24th. On the 25th of Kislev, the Maccabees entered the temple and looked for the oil to rekindle the menorah. And that was when a second miracle happened. The first miracle was that they beat the Greeks, a small band of Maccabees, a tiny Jewish army, compared to the huge trained military of the Greeks. It was miraculous that they won the war the day beforehand. The second miracle was that they went into the temple and looked for this pure oil, and they found this one jar of pure oil with the seal of the high priest, and then they poured it into the menorah and lit it. Now, it should have naturally just stayed alight for one day, but the next day, which was the 26th of Kislev, they saw it was still alight, and it miraculously burned for a complete 8 days. So you have the number 24, which was the miracle of the war, the number 25, which is the miracle of finding the jar of oil, and the number 26, where we see the miracle of the light continuing, even though naturally it should have extinguished. It says in Kabbalah as follows. 24 represents the 24 letters in the words Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed. When you say Shema Yisrael, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad aloud, and then we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed silently. Count up the number of letters in Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed. There's 24. Count up the number of letters in Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. There's 25. The number 26 is the gematria, is the numerical value of the Shem Havaya of God's Tetragrammaton, the four-lettered name of God, Yud, Hey, Vav, and a final Hey. 24, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed. 25, Shema Yisrael. 26, Shem Havaya. In Tanya, Shar HaYichud Ve'emunah, the Alter Rebbe explains that Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is Yichuda Ilah, the higher level of unity. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed is Yichuda Tata, the lower level of unity. What does all that mean? What does it mean that the battle against the Greeks was won on the 24th, corresponding to Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay La'olam Va'ed, the lower level of unity, Yichuda Tata? The finding of the jar of oil on the 25th corresponds to Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Yichuda Ilah. And when the oil continued to burn miraculously, that corresponds to 26, which is the numerical value of Hashem's name. That sounds all too mystical. But let's unravel and reveal its mystery. I'm old enough to have been alive at the time of the 6-day war. If you can calculate it, I was in fact 4 years old. But I remember it. I remember it because my father, Oliver Sholem, actually left Manchester, which was where we lived, to volunteer to go and fight in the 6-day war. It was miraculous. In 6 days, the small army of Israel, surrounded by huge Nasser's armies and the Jordanians, the Syrians, and so on and so forth, in a mere 6 days, there was such an unbelievable miracle. and that Israel almost tripled its land size. And I think it aroused such huge pride in the Jewish world. Jews who were even, how should we say, perhaps ashamed of their Jewish identity, suddenly became proud of their identity. There was a euphoric feeling in the Jewish world. And quite rightly so. It was a miracle. People ask, do miracles happen nowadays? Well, against all odds, the Six-Day War was a modern-day miracle. And yet it was a miracle enclosed in nature. One could have put the winning of the war down to, I think it was General Hodd's brilliance of attacking the Egyptian airstrips early in the morning when they were having a tea break. It could have been put down to the brilliance of the generals who attacked in Sinai and in the Golan. But at the end of the day, as we saw, unfortunately, in 1973, when the euphoria of 67 quite evaporated, we see that there was a miracle, something higher than nature, which in fact was the same miracle that happened in 73, although after a terrible cost. It showed us the Jewish world was just wowing, but it was a miracle enclosed within nature. If you parallel that to the winning of the war of the Maccabees against the Greeks, there are some parallels. The Jewish army in the times of the Maccabees were relatively weak against the huge armies of the Greeks, who had battle elephants, superior military hardware, and they weren't as well trained perhaps as their counterparts. They didn't have all the infrastructure perhaps which they had, and they didn't have the masses. And yet, Rabbim fell biad ma'atim, Giborim fell biad chaloshim. The mighty fell into the hands of the weak. And that itself was a great miracle. And we say thanksgiving to Hashem for that miracle. That miracle happened on the 24th. That's Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Elolam Voed, which is Yehuda Tatar. What does Yehuda Tatar, the lower level of unity, mean? The lower level of unity is that when we look at God and God looks at us, there are two viewpoints. The way we look at God is we exist, but we acknowledge the presence of God. Ve'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. You should love the Lord your God. So you exist, and through meditation and contemplation, and looking at the beauties and works of creation, and higher than creation, you become cognizant, aware, and experience the divine within your soul, and it brings you to a state of loving, cleaving, of ecstasy, but you still exist. There is, if you want, the yesh, the matter. There is the being down here. In terms of the battle, there was the army that won the war. Yes, through various turns of events, it was miraculous that things happened to facilitate the miracle, but at the end of the day, it was won by a military machine. And consequently, the number 24 represents a miracle that took place within nature. The next day, they entered into the temple precinct. What were they looking for? The Greeks had defiled the oils. They knew that. They knew that this battle, Matisyahu Maccabee knew that the battle against the Greeks was not just against any invader, just to free the republic from the invader. No. The battle against the Greeks was a spiritual battle, especially because, and perhaps this is not so noted, that even amongst the Jews in those days, there was an internal struggle. There were many Jews who were what were called Misyavnim, Jews who had been terribly influenced by Greek culture, Jews who had become more Greek than the Greeks. And the Battle of the Maccabees was not just against the Greek armies, but it was against the, if you want, influence of Greek culture and theology, which had made great inroads into the Jewish community. So they actually needed to look for the purity of the seal of the high priest. The high priest represents the Jew, who is the holiest Jew. That holiest Jew who enters into the holiest place and the holiest time in the year, once a year on Yom Kippur. The Maccabees knew that in order to rededicate this temple, they had to go for something which was purer than any infiltration or tumah, impurity, which the Greeks had imparted. And that was on the 25th. That is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That is what we call Yichud Ilah, the view from above. From God's point of view, creation is a mere manifestation of his divine creativity. From God's point of view, the whole world is there in order to serve as a vessel, a conduit for the service to the divine. Every echelon of creation, being inanimate, vegetable, animal, or human, is there to serve God on its level. And there's a pyramid of elevation of where we can take the olive, crush it into oil, light it, and it will give out light, warmth. Neir mitzvah, the light of mitzvah, and Torah, the light of Torah, the temple. That's all it represented. It was a house of God. And in order to rededicate it, it had to be rededicated on the level of Yichud Ilah, on the higher level of unity where nothing else exists but God. When we say Shema Yisrael, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. What should we think when we say the words Hashem Echad? So it says in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, what we should think of is the Daled, which numerically is number 4, represents the 4 corners of the world, north, south, east, and west. Ches, the letter Ches, represents the number 8, which is the 7 heavens and the earth. So the earth in all its directions, the heavens and the earth is all part of Aleph. Echad is all part of Aleph, the Alufo Shel Olam, the commander-in-chief of the world. Because it's all made and created ex nihilo, something from nothing, anew and afresh every single second by God. Or in the words of the Rambam, that Kol hanimtsoim lo nimtzu ela me'amitis himotzoi. The Rambam opens his Mishnah Torah, his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, with the words Yesod HaYesodus, the foundation of all foundations, the Amud HaChochmos, and the pillar of all wisdoms is Leda, is to know Sheyesham Motzu Yerishon, that there is a primordial being, and that Kol HaNimtsoim, and that everything is to be found, Lo Nimtzu Ela Me'amitis Himotzoi, is only found from the very truth of his existence. So his existence is what we call a mechuyev hametzias, a necessary primordial existence. Nothing came before him, and we are all a dependent existence, dependent on the Creator for our vitality. That's Yichud Ilah, that there's nothing else besides God, or as we say in Hebrew, Ein Oid Milvado. That is the miracle of the 25th, which is the miracle of finding the jar of oil with the seal of the high priest. However, there's one level which is higher than that. When we say Shema Yisrael, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. We use the name Hashem twice. It's explained in Kabbalah that there's something called Havaya de Le'ela and Havaya de Latata, the upper Hashem and the lower Hashem, which means there is Hashem as he's manifest in the Seder Hishtalshelus, in the chain order of creation. But then there is Havaya de Le'ela, there is God as he completely transcends creation. Now, that was represented by the miracle of the lights lasting for 8 days. Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, who was called the Rashba, writes in, he's a Spanish medieval scholar, Halaches, a great posek, and he wrote that what is the difference between number 8 and number 7? Number 7 is and this is also, we find it clearly in the writings of the Maharal of Prague, number 7 represents the natural cycle. 7 years of the sabbatical cycle, 7 times 7 into the Jubilee, 7 days of the week. The number 7 is the natural order. Number 8 is that which transcends nature. And consequently, Brit Milah, circumcision, is on the 8th day because it's the transcendent imprint on the very body of the Jew that whatever they are or do or say or feel, they are still Jewish. And the same thing is with the 8 days of Hanukkah. The 8 days of Hanukkah are the 8 days, and hence the number 8 and the 8 lights, which transcend even the level of Yichud Ilah. That's the level which is completely transcendent of any creation. Interesting it is when the Maccabees precipitated and fought and then entered into the temple and like this, it was their Mesirus Nefesh, it was their self-sacrifice that precipitated the miracle. Miracles happen because we do something. And it was their self-sacrifice that they were willing to go against the armies that precipitated this miracle. Now you can ask logically, it really doesn't make sense. If you have such a big military machine, well, go along with it. Why fight against it? And yet, Matisyahu Maccabee, even though he was outnumbered, even though it was against all odds, when he saw things that were not right, and we saw the soul of Judaism at stake, he put everything aside, and he didn't even think about the Greeks. He just went with the feeling that there's nothing else apart from Hashem. In fact, the word Maccabee stands from the words Mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem. Who is amongst the strong ones like you, Hashem? Mi kamocha, who is like you, ba'elim, amongst the strong ones, Hashem? In other words, that was actually written on his sword. He knew that it wasn't going to be his sword that was going to win the war, but it was going to be the fact that he'd completely given himself over to Hashem, and that, if Hashem wanted, the Greek army was to be routed. We can now fast forward to Yud Tes Kislev. As we asked at the beginning of this class, what is the juxtaposition between Yud Tes Kislev, public menorahs, and what we've just said? In the story of Yud Tes Kislev, the Alter Rebbe was arrested by the Russian government. A very powerful government at the time, and he was originally sentenced to death. And it was only after 53 days of interrogation did they themselves come to the realization that this was a holy man, and that his cause was holy, and that he wasn't a revolutionary, and he was vindicated, he was set free, he was liberated. And that, of course, as we said, was the green lights from above for the dissemination of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, let's think in and correlate this with what we've just said. The Alter Rebbe said, why was he incarcerated? Because zayis, an olive, kashemevatshinle, when you squeeze it, oil comes out. What happened in this incarceration is that there had to be a radical move forward so that the teachings of the inner dimension of the Torah should be spread in such a way that even the nations of the world would become aware of it, so that godliness would be manifest not just inside but outside, not just within the Jewish people but within the Ummas Ha'olam. Hifli v'higdil, it says. The Alter Rebbe's liberation was an amazing thing, that the very people that placed him in jail liberated him and made him an honorary citizen for all generations. It says that we should light the Hanukkah candles, as we have said beforehand, mi Pesach beisai v'lachutz, outside. Why? Lehoir es hacheshech, to illuminate the darkness. The whole point of the lights of Hanukkah is when the Maccabees saw the spiritual darkness of the Greeks, they understood that they had to illuminate that darkness. But to illuminate that darkness, you actually have to go on an inward bound journey to a level within you which reaches your very core, the quintessence of the Jew, the level of Yechida, the Pintele Yid, that part of the Jew where there is nothing else apart from the Jew and God. And on that level, once that's fully revealed, that's the level that can combat the darkness, even the deepest dark of the outside. That one Hanukkah candle can reveal that darkness. How do you access the deepest levels of your soul? The Alter Rebbe taught us it's through the deepest teachings of the Torah. Because Pnimius HaTorah, the inner level of the Torah, can reveal the inner level of the Jew, which connects with the deepest element of God. And therefore, there's a huge correlation and connection between Yud Tes Kislev and Hanukkah. Because everything in history is a progression. We're moving towards the coming of Mashiach. We are moving towards a moment when the entire world will recognize the oneness of Hashem. In the words of the Rambam in the end of Laws of Malachim, Ube'oise hazman, at that time, lo yeh esek ha'olam elo l'dasas Hashem b'lvad. The entire engagement of the world will be to know God. And consequently, the beginnings of that is and are the revelation of the inner dimension of the Torah, which reveals to the average intellect in the Chachma, Bina, V'das of the human being, godliness. So that there's a fusion of the human mind and the Almighty in a yichud nifla, in an unbelievable unity, as explained in Tanya in chapter 5. And all this was revealed, these teachings were revealed post Yud Tes Kislev. And therefore Hanukkah, which carries on from Yud Tes Kislev, takes on a different dimension. And the Rebbe brought it not just literally by our front doors or windows, but he took it out to the nations of the world. Because the French in the Eiffel Tower, and the English in Trafalgar Square, and the Americans in Washington, D.C., ultimately, they too, V'hoisal Hashem HaMelucha, will come to recognize the oneness of God. By Yom Hahu, Yiyeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. Do you know how Rashi translates the words Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad in Chumash? Have a look in the parsha of Etz Chanan. Rashi translates Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, the God who is our God now. Hashem Echad will be the one God when Mashiach will come, and all the nations of the world will recognize that oneness of godliness. Which festival brings out to the outside world the light of number 8 over number 7, the transcendent light, which is 26, not 25 or 24, but it's that which completely transcends. And because it's the most powerful, highest transcendent light, it can illuminate the greatest darkness, which are the street, the nations, the entire world. This is the festival of Hanukkah. And consequently, as we go shortly into this festival of Hanukkah, let us use the power of Yutes Kislev, the power of the revelation of the deepest levels of the Torah, to realize that when we light our Hanukkah candles, we're connecting with Yehuda Maccabee, with all the Maccabees, with all the previous generations of Jews that have kept that flame alive. And that flame represents the flame of the core of Judaism, of Jewish pride, of that which transcends nature, of that which goes to the very essence of godliness, and therefore it's specifically that light that can illuminate even the greatest darkness. And that's why the Rebbe brought it out so publicly. Yehi Ratzon may it be Hashem's will, that through all of our candle lighting now in Hanukkah, we merit that we actually will see the Neir Shel Zion, the true lights of the Beis Hamikdash again, when Mashiach will come. Ubayom hahu, and on that day, Yiyeh Hashem echad u'shmei echad, Hashem will be one, His name will be one, in the sense that all the nations of the world will recognize the oneness of Hashem, and we will be able to see the beautiful lights of the Beis Hamikdash shining outwards to the world, and we will merit the coming of Mashiach B'mheira B'yameinu. Amen.